I believe that we are now live. Cool. So I am going to put this out here. Great. So we have a few people that are joining us right now. So, but let's go ahead and just get started. So for those of you who have just joined or are slowly starting to join us, I would love for you to just type away in the live chat box and let us know where you're coming from, what you're doing, and maybe if you have any sort of intention for tonight's event, or wherever you're coming from tonight, this morning, wherever you are in the world. So, Ellen, I would love to get started soon. So maybe first I should introduce myself. For those of you who are listening, my name is Nadia Hassan, and I am the founder of Zaya, which is an education platform with the intention to really elevate the integration of holistic approaches to medicine in different healthcare systems, as well as in the lives of different individuals who are experiencing any sort of mental health conditions, as well as physical illnesses as well. And so one of the ways that I've been doing this is by hosting these bi-weekly events and workshops and really trying to spread the message on different practices of holistic medicine and non-conventional approaches to medicine. And so the event tonight is really here to support those who are wanting to learn more about the use of psychiatric medication, as well as how to really support yourself when you are making the decision to taper off of some of these medications, and how to do it safely, how to do it holistically. And so before we really get started, I just want to say that please always consult your doctor before seeking any sort of, making any sort of decisions on this, because it can be very dangerous and it can be a very scary thing. So just wanted to make that clear first. So let's go ahead and get started. Ellen, I'm so happy that you're here. I would love to just first have you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, and and how you got started in all of this.
Great. Thanks, Nadia. I'm Ellen Vora. I'm a holistic psychiatrist, and I'm based in New York City. And I got into this because, I don't know, in high school, I was into biology and English. So it seemed like, okay, maybe I'll go to med school. And then that was a terrible mistake. But then in the midst of it, it was clear to me that I was interested in the human body, but I also was interested in groping in the dark of the human experience and what it means to be a human being on this giant rock barreling through space. And so I was going to go into psychiatry. Any English major out of college ends up in med school, they're going to go into psychiatry. So save yourself trouble. If you're wondering what specialty to choose, it's psychiatry. But then once I started learning psychiatry, I was really in crisis. I was so disenchanted with how I was being taught to manage people's mental health. And I was taught how to put people on really elaborate cocktails of medication. And I felt like maybe I was helping manage symptoms to a certain extent, but I didn't really feel like I was helping my patients thrive. And I started to see how some medications were habit forming or difficult to get off of. And it started opening really, really uncomfortable questions in that sense of like the oath that we take as physicians, do no harm. I wasn't entirely convinced that I was always doing no harm when I was putting people on meds. And in parallel with my disenchantment with what I was being taught, I was really unhealthy. All through med school, residency, my health was a struggle. And I felt like I had all the resources to be well. Like I was literally a doctor. I knew what made the human body healthy. I had access to great doctors and to all the textbooks and all the knowledge and the medical journals. And it seemed like everything I did was not only not working, but kind of just making matters worse. So I had to go on a bit of a 10-year inefficient autodidactic journey of figuring out, how do I keep myself well? How do I actually help my patients thrive? And that's how I started to practice in the way I do. It came from like really pursuing a lot of different modalities and approaches, different ways that people approach this question of the human body and how do we keep it healthy and well. And so I studied Chinese medicine and acupuncture and Ayurveda, and I became a yoga teacher, like you always do. I went to Bali for a while, like everyone does on one of these journeys, and studied nutrition and something called functional medicine. And now that, it informs what I do. And I'm now this really happy, lucky, fulfilled, healthy doctor. And I am myself in a state of balance, and I work with my patients to get them feeling well and thriving. And so it's like, it was very uncertain and touch and go and kind of scary for a while, but I consider myself really lucky now to do what I do and to have gone on that journey.
Wow, that's incredible. So I'm so curious, in the field of psychiatry, do you feel like you kind of went against the grain in some sort of sense? And if so, what was that response from some of your colleagues and your peers?
Yeah, I'm so against the grain. And I don't know, you'd have to ask my family, like, have I always been? Yes and no. Like, it's a little bit, I'm like a weird combination of, I like rules. I like following rules, but they really have to feel like that they make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as a rule to me feels like absurd or like actually counterproductive, I get a little bit rebellious. So when rules make sense, like traffic laws, I love, it's like, I think there should be more. I think we need like a straight arrow on a car to indicate like you're not just turning left or right, but straight. So someone knows if there's no turn signal, you know that person is just not indicating. You don't know that they're going straight, right? So I think that I do love rules, but I don't love things that don't make sense. And I think that medicine at this point is this pretty broken, like we're marionetted by the pharmaceutical industry. So a lot of our decisions, our choices are built on a foundation of guidelines formed by experts that get kickbacks from the pharmaceutical industry. Our standard of care is based on what gets studied, then within what gets studied, what gets published, what gets adopted into standard of care. And all of that is really fueled by moneyed interests. So there's like a lot of financial incentives that are pushing the agenda. And money doesn't really belong in healthcare. It needs to be people that aren't like we don't want those perverse incentives when it comes to the health of our bodies, our families. Like it shouldn't be part of that conversation. So I don't know, to answer, I'm totally against the grain in psychiatry, but I think psychiatry has really lost its way. And I would say that my colleagues who are still more conventional many of them are themselves in some form of crisis where they think like, I'm not finding this line of work satisfying. Something doesn't feel good about this, but maybe they can't quite put their finger on why.
Yeah. Do you usually try to kind of bring them over to your side or tell them or maybe open them up to some of these other sort of holistic approaches?
Depends on what mood I'm in. Yeah. I don't
Yeah.
know. Like, if you're over, like, I think that I don't know. Yeah. There's settings where I'm like always just like, probably to everyone's chagrin, like I'm just up on my soapbox being like, did you think about it this way? And then there are other times when like I try to assume more of like a humble and spiritual, non-attached approach of like, everyone is on their own journey. And if people want to read up on this, I will always happily give people book recommendations, but like, it doesn't always feel right to be like out trying to convince people to change their minds, but sometimes I'm in the mood for it.
Yeah, that's really important. So I guess to help our listeners to really get an understanding of your experience and really some of the conditions that you are very familiar with, what are some of the common conditions that you work with and that you treat, and even some of the most common conditions that you're starting to see with this rise in mental health?
Yeah, so I would say for the most part, it's what we would call depression, anxiety, ADHD, bipolar, insomnia. I treat very little schizophrenia. I sort of feel like my approach doesn't lend itself to the psychotic disorders. And then I end up being a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but helping with things like autoimmune illness, digestive disturbances, sometimes fertility issues. I think sometimes I have some value to add to those issues that my patients might be, you know, one part getting their care with a naturopath or an endocrinologist, but I might be weighing in.
Okay. Okay. And so then working in this field, what do you believe has been some of the most contributing factors to this rise in a lot of the mental health disorders that we're seeing globally? You know, there was one statistic that I found that mental health prescriptions have increased in the US by 35% since the pandemic, since coronavirus. And that was for anti-anxiety meds. And then depression was at 20%. And anti-insomnia was also around, I think, 14% as well. What do you think that some of that has been pre-pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's kind of like the pre-pandemic story and then the pandemic story. So pre-pandemic, technology plays a big role in this. I do think that social media and even just screens in general, the fact that we bring our phones into the bedroom at night and kind of like doom scroll and don't even realize it's an addiction, and that it pushes our bedtime a little bit later, disrupts our circadian rhythm, which in turn disrupts our hormones, our HPA axis, our thyroid function. And then we're not getting as good quality sleep. Like that alone is enough to have drastic ramifications. So something as simple as just we like our phones and we bring them into the bedroom because it's our alarm clock. It's also what we read before bed. That's having an outsized impact. Social media itself is causing a lot of that comparison thinking and just feeling like, okay, well, this person looks great and they're on the beach smiling, and you know, here I am, like a bag of potato chips in and binging something on Netflix, and people feel down on themselves and it's just so hard for our brain to not realize like the person on the beach smiling like only feels the need to showboat to the world that they're doing great because there is some deep underlying insecurity of like, am I doing great? And I think that we all have the couch moments, we all have the beach moments, and it's very hard for the human mind to realize like it's not that everyone else is doing well and you're not. And I think that there is also this feeling of being left out. Like in the olden days, we could feel like maybe everyone else is home on a Friday night when I am. And maybe you'd show up to school on Monday and hear murmurings of a party that you weren't invited to. But it was a little more of an analog time scale, and it wasn't going to impact you quite so much. Whereas kids these days can instantly look on TikTok or, you know, they're more likely on Instagram and basically see a lot of the cool kids in their grade are hanging out together without them. And you, rather than hearing about it on Monday morning, you're seeing it in real time, like over and over. So I think it just it's really damaging. It makes people feel left out. It makes people, there's a hardwiring human need to feel accepted and belonging in the group. On the savannah of evolution, that was kind of a life or death issue. These days in modern life, it's not quite like that, but it can still feel that way to our hardwiring.
And so it seems like that is generally the case for the younger crowd, right?
Yeah.
So like Gen X or something like that.
Yeah. Or Gen Z. Yeah. And
Gen
Z,
Z,
skyrocketing.
yeah.
I like dyslexic those all the time. And they have like skyrocketing, you know, levels of depression, anxiety, suicidal thinking.
Yeah. So then what about, you know, some of the older crowd, basically? What are some of the reasons for that? Like maybe diet, for example, or any sort of other issues that you've seen?
Yeah, we can sort of lump diet into all things environmental exposure. I think that what's happened with our diet and our exposures in the last, like, I would say it really changed around 1980 when it started to be that we use high fructose corn syrup instead of sugar. And I think we all just kind of learned, and there's so many trends that go along with this, including some positive trends, like more women in the workplace. So there's not someone necessarily home dedicated to cooking the homemade food for the family all the time. And even just like trends in the 50s of it was a sign of luxury to have processed foods, you know, that looked kind of clean and fancy. But I think what's really happened is our food system has just become totally deranged. Massive, powerful lobbies that have sold us foods that are not only nutritionally devoid, but they really behave like drugs in our bodies and they're inflammatory. Mm-hmm. So we're really addicted to processed foods that really make our bodies sick. And it's pervasive. And so you really see like entire generations of people that are by and large inflamed. And it's not like a few of us, it's kind of all of us are a bit more inflamed than we otherwise would be. We just don't have a food system, an agricultural system in place to give us food from soil that had nutrients, real foods that are nutritionally replete, that our body recognizes as food. And culturally, we're just not in the habit of eating real food. We eat variations on food. We sort of eat these food-like products that really behave like drugs, and that's what we all think of as normal. And so we're malnourished, but overfed and inflamed. And it's causing things like the disruption to the health of our digestive tract, where so much of the health of our body, really the foundation is set in our gut. And if we have a healthy, diverse ecosystem of bacteria, and if we have a competent gut lining, then we will actually have a properly calibrated immune system. We'll absorb our nutrients. Things work pretty well. We'll have good serotonin levels. But when that starts to get compromised, then all the screws start falling out of the machine.
So as a holistic psychiatrist, what are some of the approaches that you integrate with some of your patients?
Yeah, I would say it varies, but it generally starts with food. I always think of a lot of what happens in mental health as kind of having these there's like the physiologic root causes, and then there's the truth carried in the symptoms. So what I don't think is like, okay, you have depression. It's a genetic destiny. It's a chemical imbalance in your brain that's corrected by a pill. Again, it's not that simple to me. It's basically, well, these are the symptoms you're manifesting with right now. What are the root causes? And it's usually some combination of physiological root causes, which can be things like digestive disturbance, micronutrient deficiencies, inflammation, hormone imbalance, which itself has its own root causes, thyroid issues, blood sugar swings. Like it can be really mundane, caffeine sensitivity, gluten intolerance, things like that. And then there's like always trauma is always on my mind. I always have an eye towards like, what is the trauma and how is this kind of like, how did this organism basically come up with coping strategies to just survive that are maybe now maladaptive? So I'm always having an eye toward that. And then I think the symptoms often convey important information. Like sometimes our anxiety is really our body telling us something's not right here. And maybe it is something as simple as something physiologic, but sometimes it's our body saying we're out of alignment with our career, with our relationship, or where we live, with politics, with racial injustice, with climate change. Sometimes it's our body kind of telling us there's something wrong, take action. And so there's a lot of truth to our mental illness symptoms, something to be heeded and really honored and listened to. But a lot of it is actually just unnecessary symptoms that are related to a state of physiologic imbalance.
That's so important. So how do psychiatric medications kind of play a role in addressing some of these issues that you've mentioned?
Yeah, so I guess in my practice, I don't find that it's often necessary to start people on meds. I'm usually going to take a different approach, but I always want to point out, because like anyone who's tuning into something on mental health, they're going to, many people will be on meds. And I think that in the holistic world, you'll get a lot of different philosophies on psych meds. And I take a pretty moderate approach, which is that like if you're on psych meds and they're helping you, that's not a problem. That's a great thing. I say hallelujah to that. If you have something that's working for you, the name of the game here is not like total purity or anything like that. It's really just, how can we help you thrive in your life? How can you lead a fulfilling life? And if meds are setting a foundation for you to be able to do that, great. No need to second guess that. It's more that I'm really interested in addressing, well, for me, I just want to understand what are the root causes of mental illness? Is it truly a Lexapro deficiency disorder, or is there something else at play? And then there are these millions of people who aren't sufficiently helped by meds. And my field of psychiatry has kind of left them high and dry. We sort of say, hey, there's meds, there's CBT, good luck. And we know that meds are not effective for everyone. Sometimes they're effective, but someone has intolerable side effects. Sometimes they're effective temporarily, but the effect wears off. So there's a lot of folks out there that are feeling like their needs aren't met by the current offerings. So for those folks, I'm really interested in saying, don't lose hope. There is so much we can do. And like, let's look under the hood. Let's figure out why you're having these symptoms of depression or anxiety. What's really the state of imbalance or the trauma or the call to action that's underneath this experience.
Wow.
So to answer the question, I mean, I basically don't start people on meds, but that doesn't mean I think that they should suffer. You know, it's more like, what's really going on here? Was it actually always a thyroid issue or a B12 deficiency or a blood sugar issue? And I address that. And for the most part, that gets someone a lot of the way there. And then that last little bit is usually where we roll up our sleeves and kind of get into their lived experience. Like, what is your body communicating to you through these symptoms?
But you also have people that come to you who are seeking the discontinuation of some of these psych meds as well. Am I correct?
Yeah.
So what do you do and how do you help your patients start to get into that process of tapering off some of these drugs?
Yeah. So you know that like at the beginning you kind of said something to the effect of this is not medical advice, this is educational, and like, you know, that's like a medical legal waiver, but I think that there's something even more importantly true when it comes to med discontinuation, which is like, it's just not something to be approached alone. When I have patients who are going through this process, they have me and I want really close communication with them. Like, we're checking in frequently. And so when I think about people like navigating this without a supportive provider, that makes me very worried because I know how touch and go and kind of hairy it can get. And so it's the kind of thing that you need to sort of be plugged into a treatment setting where you have someone who gets it, who's in support of this, and then who helps you through the process and stays in very close touch. Because often you need someone to reflect to you, you're in withdrawal, like, let's talk through the dark thoughts that might be coming up. So how I approach it with patients, we take a deep breath. It's a big process. Sometimes it's no big deal, but sometimes it's a very big deal. And we'll do things like, I will usually want to ready somebody for about a month before they make a change. So that's with really good diet, usually like a Whole30 diet. So they're getting really nutrient dense food for a month. They're not getting inflamed for a month. Like, really sets the body up to take on this big process. And a little bit of detox support, which I kind of separate out into hardcore and softcore. Like, hardcore detox is like the coffee enema and the infrared sauna. For some people, that ends up being pretty critical to allowing for a smooth taper. For other people, just things like Epsom salt bath, dry skin brushing, coconut oil pulling, starting the day with a glass of water, jumping on a trampoline, things like that can be enough to support your body's detox pathways. And then when we start, I'll usually work with a compounding pharmacy and decrease by about 10% per month. So that's just a starting like goal, and it's not set in stone. It really changes as the taper goes on, especially towards the end of a taper. You might go dramatically more slowly than that just to get off gently. The goal is to make this a sustainable process. So like, there's no rush. You go really patiently and gently so that your body can handle it, so that you're not tripped into withdrawal. And I think the withdrawal is a really important issue because, like, basically we're all kind of just, we automatically think that if we're getting off of a psychiatric medication and we become symptomatic, we call that relapse. And we think like, oh, look how depressed I was. Look how anxious I was. I really did need this med. It really was helping. But that's not what that shows us. What that shows us is simply, this is you in withdrawal from a powerful psychoactive substance. And so I really want my patients to know they're in withdrawal and to be able to attribute the symptoms to withdrawal and not to start to think, I'm in relapse, it will always be this way. That can feel like, you can start to feel pretty doomed to always feeling this way. Withdrawal, you can recognize as a self-limiting temporary state. And the last thing is I encourage people to meditate and really get so committed to good sleep habits and exercise so that they're just doing everything they can to kind of keep their nervous system out of a fear response. It's pulling out meds kind of pulls out the rug from underneath your brain, and it can put the brain and the body into a stress response. So you want to combat that just with daily practice that puts you in a relaxation response.
I'm curious because when you say that, meditation can be really difficult for people sometimes, especially people, with anxiety, or if they're starting to come off of psychiatric medications, they can start to experience, difficulty in sleeping. So what are some other tools that you've sort of helped implement into some of the people that, your clients, your patients that you've had, that have been really effective for them?
Yeah, so
Like meditation, for example.
if I'm doing like a corporate wellness presentation and I'm talking about stress and burnout, like I won't actually ask people to start a meditation practice, because I've learned over the years, I'm convincing like 1 out of 50 people, maybe at best. And so for that audience, I'm telling them more like, just do less. Like if you don't want to meditate, if you're not ready to take that on as a daily practice, just look at your calendar and X out some things. Like just do less overall, build in more unstructured time, more genuine leisure time that you fiercely protect, where you're not scrolling, you're not watching Netflix, you're just truly in leisure, unplugged, grounded, in nature, playing, whatever works. For someone who is going through a medication taper, like I think when I've seen patients go through it, people have a hard time with it or an easier time with it. And the patients who have had an easier time with it take it very seriously and really commit to these practices. So you kind of have to buy in to the fact that the meditation is not negotiable. People don't sometimes, but I sort of see the struggle. So people that really do make it just like brushing your teeth. It's just like, I don't even second guess this. I just sit and meditate for a few minutes every morning. Their tapers go more smoothly. And I think that one of the things that, I try to demystify it, like meditation can be as simple as you're just showing up, eyes closed, you're still. It's that simple. And like gradually, can we just like go on a magic carpet ride with our thoughts? If we do that, we totally can. But eventually you sort of become more of a witness to it. You start to observe your mind. You see the patterns. Can you bring compassion to that? Can you separate just a bit from your thoughts and not fully identify with them? I think that happens organically as you just sit and show up in stillness and start to observe your mind. For some of my patients, I have them do breath work, like inhaling to the count of 4, holding to the count of 7, exhaling to the count of 8 is a really nice practice. And it's a nice hack for the nervous system, because anytime we extend our exhale longer than our inhale, it actually just sort of short circuits and puts our body in a relaxation response, whether or not we're truly relaxed.
Mm-hmm. So after one starts to finally, like their withdrawal symptoms start to decrease and they find themselves finding it easier, there must still be some sort of damage that has been done to the body or the brain after using psych meds for a long period of time. And I mean, is it possible to be able to reverse some of the damage and the harmful effects that have been caused by that?
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and I'm very optimistic. I think that like the brain is plastic, it grows and it changes, but it does require patience. So it doesn't happen on the time scale that we sometimes want. And I do think this is the nature of the brain. The brain is sort of like this machine of learning. It is designed to learn, and it learns to rely on psych meds, and it can also learn to not rely on psych meds. It can heal, but there's a lot we can do to create the conditions for that plasticity and neurogenesis and regeneration. And so I do think it's important to recognize like you're not doomed and the brain can heal, but also to be so patient and to recognize that that subacute withdrawal phase can be quite long. And so like I'll have patients take many, many months to get off their meds. Sometimes it takes more than a year. And that's not to say like feel like unmotivated to even start, because there's always a point relatively early on in a taper where you're really no longer medicated. you're not in a therapeutic dose of the medicine anymore. You feel like yourself, you feel your feelings more deeply, but you are just staving off withdrawal by going gradually. So, so I don't want people to feel like it takes a year to go off of meds. What's the point of even trying? It takes several months to fully be off the meds, but then you're still on a baby dose, basically just to allow your brain to build kind of the equivalent of what's called collateral circulation. Like if the heart has blockages in the coronary arteries, it slowly can build other arteries to sort of take over. The brain does something similar. As we're slowly pulling off a medication, it's slowly allowed to rebuild receptors and transporters. But so you want to go gradually, but then even once you're fully off, you're in kind of acute withdrawal for a period of time, but then you're in subacute withdrawal for several months. And I think that to just recognize that if you kind of out of nowhere get hit by a wave of it feeling really tough, to be gentle with yourself, but to remind yourself this is withdrawal and there are going to be days like this, and to flow with it and give yourself whatever comfort you need to get through that hard day. And then to recognize the next day might look completely different. Things to do to promote the plasticity: chanting, breath work, meditation, good nutrition and sleep, always exercise. Then also things like, there are substances that are interesting for this. Like I think psychedelic medicine and ketamine play an interesting role in neuroplasticity. I think that whether or not someone's getting off of psych meds, they play an interesting role in helping unstuck a brain that's really entrenched in certain patterns. So it can be helpful with things like OCD and addiction and trauma. And so there's a lot that we can do, but you do need like a good coach, like a good support who understands how to be your quarterback and help navigate all of those decisions.
Yeah, and I'm sure that must be really difficult for some people to be able to find that support, especially from, their doctors or maybe their psychiatrists, when they're wanting to have this sort of holistic approach. And when they start to taper off of these medications. And so how can people speak to their doctors? How can they start to bring up these conversations with whoever it is that they're working with, whichever medical professional that they're working with?
Yeah, it's tough. I think that, I guess in a way, I think about like the analogy here is that when I go to a restaurant, I will say like, I'm gluten-free and dairy-free. And like, I can kind of read the menu, but I guess in a way I'm sort of trying to vote with my mouth. Like I'm trying to just increase awareness that there's market demand for like a more paleo template meal at a restaurant. And I think that every time we bring it up with a doctor and we say, I'm interested in tapering off of my antidepressant, you'll be met with resistance a lot of the time. A lot of doctors will say, that's inadvisable. There's no protocol for that. I don't think that that's safe. Like as if like if you had asked them when they were starting this med, if you were like, so am I going to be on this forever? They'd be like, no. But then once you're actually like, okay, I'm good, I want to taper off, they'll be like, I think it's inadvisable. So you'll get that resistance a lot. And I think in a way, every time someone has that conversation with a practitioner, it's planting a little seed. It's just ever so slightly and slowly opening physicians' eyes to the fact that there is demand for not thinking about these as lifelong medications. For like, if you haven't yet, learn a process for safely getting your patients off of meds. So even if you get resistance, you might be sort of carving a path for somebody else to have more support. And then if your practitioner is supportive, great, basically work with them. I think most often, even if you have someone who's willing to work with you on it, you need to kind of get your education elsewhere. The internet is actually sort of, that's where the trusted sources are. It's also where there's a lot of wrong information. So you have to be discerning. But basically the best information it's not found in your primary care doctor's office or your psychiatrist's office, because most practitioners are not well informed about this. They'll say things like, oh, we'll take 3 weeks to taper you off, or they'll say, take it every other day. These are not good strategies. So most practitioners are uninformed. So you get your education with practitioners like Kelly Brogan's materials, my materials. There's like these forums like Benzo Buddies and Mad in America. There's all these places where you can kind of gather a free education on how to do it safely. You bring that information back to your practitioner. You say, here's the number for a compounding pharmacy nearby. Here's the dosing schedule I want to do. So you have someone who's there with you to help keep you safe, to help keep you accountable, but you're sort of bringing some of the more like high level enlightened education to them. And if you have someone who's just totally resistant, not willing to work with you, you got to kind of keep seeking, and it can be really tough. It can be really tough.
Yeah, I've met quite a few people who have just decided that they can't find a psychiatrist or anyone that's willing to support them in that journey. And so they just have to do it themselves. What are some of the dangers and the risks of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem. And I think that I don't blame people for sort of giving up, but I want to encourage people to not give up. Like, meet a few more psychiatrists until you find one who's willing to support you on it. And know it can be so tough. And sometimes it's not going to be someone in network, and that's a whole other conversation. But basically, someone who's willing to take on this time-intensive, difficult, and like high liability process with you is probably not going to be working through insurance, because anybody who wants to show up for patients in that way has already learned that the actual way that they can show up is the commodity that insurance has squeezed out. Like, it takes your time. And so I think that it's usually going to be an out-of-network service, but most people have a sliding scale. There's, sort of don't give up hope on finding someone. And then once, like, the dangers of doing it on your own are really significant. So I would say the biggest danger is suicidal thoughts come up a lot with tapering. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's like revealing your underlying genuine suicidality. I've seen it in patients. Like, I had a patient early on in my practice who he went on a SSRI when he was going through a divorce. He was really stressed. His primary care doctor put him on an SSRI. He's seeing me many years later. And at a certain point, he's like, I think I want to get off the Prozac. I was like, okay. And I was new at this. So we went slowly, but not as slowly as I go today. And he was having suicidal thoughts. And he's like, I think I'm just going to go back on it. He had never had a suicidal thought in his life. He didn't even go on it for depression. And just something in the withdrawal of these meds can create a kind of hopelessness, a dark thoughts. It can create despair. It can make people feel kind of disassociated. It's a really lethal combination potentially. And it can make people impulsive as well. So I think like the risk of suicide is quite real. And that's a reason to go slowly and with a lot of support. And other risks are, I think, that if you go too quickly, it is potentially a little bit more damaging. And like I said before, I don't believe anybody is just permanently damaged from it, but you want to go slowly so that you're not creating a bigger mess to clean up.
So true. And do you think that sometimes when people start to have these sort of symptoms that come up, like suicide, after they start to taper off, that they think that they're reversing, or that maybe some of these symptoms of their original reason why they started taking psychiatric medications is actually coming back? It's kind of almost like a reverse of everything. And so they kind of get scared. Is that usually what you see happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of different things. I think one thing is that like our psychiatric medications don't heal anything. They're not actually like a root cause resolution to anything. They are sometimes a Band-Aid. So what they do is, like, if you were going through something that you actually just needed to go through, you needed to process it, they sort of prevent that work from being completed. So the whole time you're on the med, you're in a little bit of a state of arrested development. You're not necessarily moving through whatever was the stressor, the trauma, the issue that was planting the seed for the issue in the first place, like the mental illness in the first place. So sometimes as you're coming off the med, whatever unfinished work was there when you went on the med kind of comes back in full glory and somewhat precipitously. Not to mention that if you go through something significant while you're on meds, sometimes people have a bit of like an incomplete grieving process. Like, that's a common example. Like, if someone was on meds when they lost a loved one, sometimes what you see is when they're in the withdrawal, they start really grieving. And it's almost like there was an incomplete process that happened while they were medicated and going through that. And now the process completes. And so I think just the mindset around that, like basically that to invite stormy waters, like, and to see this increase in feeling as a good thing. And I have patients who really get the hang of this, and it's quite beautiful. We culturally, we're so emotion phobic. We're so like, if we cry, we apologize, we suck it back in, you know, we think that that's bad. But I'm really good at training my patients that emotions like are good. Like if this is bubbling up, lean into it, let it be big. And so like sometimes people getting off meds have big emotional outpouring, and they can see it as a big release and positive. And we don't necessarily need to have a verbal or consciously accessible understanding of what is moving through us. Just know that it's something that needed to move through you. And so, yeah, I don't know, I forget the question, but basically like in that process, there can be so much emotional movement, and it's a positive thing. What was the question?
That's so true. It was basically how do you think that people feel like they're reversing back into, you know, maybe an old way of thinking, or, you know, starting to re-experience some of their old symptoms? But no, you answered it perfectly. That's actually, I was reading something from Laura Delano. I don't know if you know who she is, but she's a mental health advocate, and she founded the Inner Compass Initiative.
Yes, yeah.
And yeah, and something that she said that really struck me was your emotional pain is here for reasons that has something to do with faulty brain chemistry. And it's really telling you something important about the world around you. And your urge to die is really an urge to live. And it's just showing you in a completely different way that you've never heard of or never experienced before. And I think that's just so powerful. And I think that it's really important to, you know, one of the reasons why I have this event, and I always ask this question to everybody that I interview, is what do you believe is the root cause of a lot of these sort of diseases, specifically with mental health conditions? And how do you get to the root cause of it? Like, how do you help a lot of the patients that you see? How do you kind of start to help them trace back to that? I interviewed a somatic experiencing practitioner and a body psychotherapist just the last week, I think it was the week before, and she talked about healing trauma in the body. And she really goes into all of these steps of reconnecting back to your body and understanding your trauma and listening to all of these symptoms. And so, like, what are some of the things that you do to help your patients get back to what was the root cause of why maybe they needed to start taking these psychiatric drugs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, sometimes I refer them for psilocybin assisted therapy to help with that. Like, I think sometimes there's nothing quite like these divine medicines when it's safe, when it's appropriate, proper set and setting, et cetera, et cetera. But sometimes when we're blocked from that, like it really actually is this royal road to the unconscious, kind of more direct than dreaming even. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's the art of psychiatry sometimes, is like to listen on multiple different valences at the same time. Like, here's the content of what someone's saying, but you're watching for little saccades, which is a word for like little eye movements. You're watching for little microfacial expressions. You're just like trying to catch the moment where they might have resistance to going deeper into something. But like, you learn through your 10,000 hours of like sitting across from people, like, that's where the money is. Like, let's go there. And you learn, like, when can you push and when do you need to play the slow game? And it's just like, I don't know. I think that it's tough, but it's like this beautiful thing when you realize you've created this therapeutic alliance, you've created this steady container, and someone finally feels safe enough to be really vulnerable. They feel brave enough to have an encounter with like some really tender pain, you know. And I think that just like going, sort of blending this with your previous question that I only half answered, like, I think about this world as like, we've lost our way in so many different ways. Like, we're poisoning everybody with our food and our chemicals, and we're emotionally phobic, and we just we have all these problems in terms of letting us just be fulfilled, thriving humans. And I think sometimes the people that show up in my office, there are sensitive people, there are feelers and are intuitives, and I mean this as the highest compliment, like witches. And it's basically we are the people that feel, but that's kind of a liability in our modern world. So people will say you're too sensitive, or why can't you eat gluten, or basically you're the people that are so emotional or irrational. And we really cast it very negatively, especially there's a sort of a patriarchal value put on rationality, and objective reasoning rather than intuition, all of this. But we need these people to guide us as a society, but instead what's happened is they're really hurting. A lot of them are the ones who are medicated. So I think sometimes the work of letting them get back to that is basically letting them reconnect with their, to use Laura Delano's idea, inner compass, that they always knew everything they needed to know, that they had this beautiful golden compass within, an intuition that was telling them, this is your true purpose, this is what's right, this is what's wrong. But we have so much conditioning throughout our lives that tells us, don't trust yourself, trust the authority, trust what we're selling you. And so I think that often I'm just trying to help people step into a little bit of a rebellious, self-assured place where they just know themselves.
And really helping them reconnect back to their intuition.
Exactly.
That's so important. Are there any holistic practitioners that you like to work with, or that you refer your patients to? And if so, who are they?
Individuals or types?
Yeah.
Well, there's Joe, there's Sally. Are people in Germany listening? It's going to be a long time. So, I love all the witchcraft, and there's a certain, to me, it kind of doesn't fully matter. If it's the chemistry is right, if it's someone who's bringing their meticulous intention, what discipline it is doesn't matter as much. But I keep my eye out for things I like osteopathic manipulation for any structural alignment issues. I like craniosacral therapy. I love Reiki. I love acupuncture, anything intuitive, anything energy, really. And I think that there's sort of this maybe somewhat out of date cliche feeling of that those are the quacks. And honestly, at this point, I kind of trust them more than I trust the conventional docs. They're people that are in their truth. Are they pretty eccentric and out there sometimes? Totally. You still have to go in and discern and take the good and leave the bad. But I think that those are people that are bravely really showing up and bringing themselves into the medicine. And I worry that in conventional medical care right now, people are just so burned out. They don't have autonomy. They're not practicing in alignment with their truth. And so to check every box and dot every I and go according to protocol and standard of care and spending so much time on charting and what gets covered by insurance and what makes you at risk of being sued, all of those parameters are just squeezing people into this really soulless practice of medicine where you're just here's standard of care, the end, and look, our time is up. And I think that it's, I don't trust that. I feel it in the moment. It's someone isn't really there with me in the room, using their mind and their education to help me problem solve what I'm struggling with. So I'll take my Reiki craniosacral therapist any day over that, just to be there with me and offer up their meticulous attention and intention.
Yeah. And if anything, if you are downing it, if anything, placebo effect is also, it's a very real thing. So I know that we spoke a lot about people who are considering getting off psychiatric medications, but what about people who are debating whether or not they should start taking them? What's some of the advice that you have for them?
I'm so glad you asked that question. So I guess, again, all the caveats of, if you have no other options, if you've gotten to a place of resolve, if you just know this is your path, and it would be really disconcerting to be told otherwise, trust yourself. But if you are really on the fence and thinking, I don't know what else my options are, I know that I have to do something, something's really not right, I do love to intervene at that moment right before someone starts psychiatric medications for the first time. To me, that's the best entry point, or even like 5 years earlier is the best entry point. But this is, sometimes the only realistic entry point. Because once you've started, the medications create the need for themselves. They make it harder to if I meet someone in my practice who's not already on meds, we can just slay, change their diet, heal their gut, get them less inflamed, get them moving through their emotions, get a little acupuncture, whatever's going on, and they fly. I see this in my practice. These are the patients where it's like, I met with them 4 times. I get, thanks for everything, bye doc. And I get an email later being like, you wouldn't believe it, but I changed my career and now I'm pregnant and everything's good, and it's like, not everything is good. Life is still challenging, as it always should be. But these are people that just fly, they soar. And when I have patients who have been on psychiatric medications at any point, it's something's a little bit more brittle, a little bit harder to make the changes. And so if you happen to be someone who has not yet taken a medication, I really encourage people to find a holistic approach, find a root cause resolution, functional medicine, naturopathic kind of approach, and start there. Because even if you later decide this wasn't the ticket and I need to start the meds, then you can always start the meds. But it's a lot harder to, once you started the meds, to go back and do the other approach. So if you are at that juncture, just try the other approaches first. And at the very end of the day, it's probably not actually a Lexapro deficiency disorder that's causing the problems. It's probably your thyroid, your B12, your gut health, your blood sugar, your gluten intolerance, whatever it is. Address that first and then see where you're at.
I really think it's interesting. I love that here you are, you're a doctor, you're a holistic psychiatrist. And one of the things that you mentioned is psychedelic medicine. I don't know. I think it's just, I would love to hear you speak on that a little bit more and your opinion on using these sort of plant medicines to really help with maybe anxiety or depression, or someone who is, experiencing some sort of trauma, even addiction. Yeah.
Yeah, psychedelic medicine, I think of as our most promising pathway ahead. And it's totally not for everyone. Truly, I don't just say this medical legally, truly a chaotic brain, a bipolar brain, a schizophrenic brain. If you have a first-degree relative with bipolar and schizophrenia, arguably, you don't want to introduce more chaos into the system. For a stuck brain, a rigid brain, an OCD brain, a chronically melancholic, depressed brain, someone who's so anxious from a place of not being able to surrender and trust that this universe is ultimately that things are ultimately going to be okay, but okay in kind of a deeper, more spiritual sense. Not, I don't mean to be white privilegey okay, oh, it'll be okay. It's not okay, right? A lot of things are not okay. The world is not okay. It's not just, it's not fair, it's not safe. That's all true. But I think that there is a little bit of an ability to trust and surrender to maybe what's happening here goes well beyond what meets the eye. And maybe we're here to carry out a certain contribution that might be really difficult, but that there is ultimately some greater order. And that's just a choice. It's a worldview. But I think sometimes I've noticed patients with a lot of material world anxiety, a kind of I don't have enough, I won't have enough. What if the worst case scenario happens? Control, control, control. It's a very conscious mind wanting to control this. Sometimes psychedelics can be helpful in just sort of blasting that open and making you realize we don't really control anything to begin with. All we can do is show up and do our best and let go of the outcome. But that these material things and these worst case scenarios that we get so wrapped up in are sometimes a very limited, myopic understanding of what's really happening here. But to answer your question, a little bit more cut and dry, psychedelics, things like ketamine, but psilocybin and maybe eventually LSD and ayahuasca, these classic psychedelics, they work in a number of different ways. They're anti-inflammatory. They promote the secretion of something called BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So the translation is they can create or promote neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, which is like what we were talking about before. They can help the brain grow and change and adapt. You can get in a new set of inputs and you can have sort of a different output. And so not be so entrenched or so rigidly stuck. They also increase global neuroconnectivity in the brain, which isn't really, it's not really clear, like, what does that mean? But it's interesting. It's almost like making new connections. One really interesting piece of research that I believe comes out of London is like this idea of the default mode network going quiet in a psychedelic ceremony. So that's the part of our brain where we kind of hang out when we're just like not actively focusing on any task. It's just where we come back to, where we're like, oh God, I'm anxious. Oh God, I don't have enough. I won't be enough. I won't have enough. And it's sort of where we future trip and dwell on the past. And it's where we really feel separate from other sentient beings and nature. And when that goes quiet in a psychedelic ceremony, we suddenly have this freedom to not just have that limited sense of the self, but actually a more expanded, connected feeling of like, maybe I'm part of something bigger. And the last piece, which I think is the most fascinating, is what's called, I think it's called the mystical experience hypothesis. So basically, the pharmaceutical industry is totally going to want to come in and say, psilocybin, this shit is good. This works better than our current medications. Let's isolate out the active ingredient and let's not deal with like the messy trip part of it, because we don't want that. And the funny thing is that when they've done good research on this, the more you have a peak life mystical experience, the greater and more enduring the clinical benefits are. So you can isolate out whatever is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms all you want, but it's actually the reckoning with our worldview, with feeling guided, feeling held, feeling loved. It's actually the mystical experience that makes it effective. So it's not just a chemical phenomenon.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you brought that up, because I also interviewed an anthropologist and a psychoanalyst also on healing with psychedelic medicine. And one of the things that we were talking about was how a lot of these companies are starting to capitalize on, psilocybin, and exactly taking out this sort of psychedelic effect of that, and how that really does interrupt with the true raw experience that you have when you do take these medicines. And yeah, I know that one particular company just went public. They went public for $1 billion, and they're doing this exactly. Just the other day, I'm like, what is happening? But everybody has their own way of doing things. But yeah, I'm so happy that you spoke to that.
So funny. I'm completely of two minds about the fact that it's like going to go mainstream. It's like, mostly let's increase the awareness, let's increase the accessibility. That's all good. But like, man, do we have a way of making everything gross? It's like a friend of mine who's in the psychedelic research world. He's like, at some point someone's going to be like drinking ayahuasca from a can at Coachella. And like, we break it. Because these are, in my opinion, like, we're going to go a little woo-woo, like, these are sacred medicines. There's like a little bit of a connection to the divine in them, and to be approached with reverence, approached in the context of the sort of indigenous traditions that they come from, like to basically just be sensitive to all of that and to have total reverence for what you're entering into. And we have a tendency to just like strip away all of the sacred and just make something like $1 billion IPO and ayahuasca in a can.
Yeah, gosh, let's hope that never happens in this world.
Yeah.
So another thing before we finish, I know that there are some psychiatrists that are probably listening in. What advice do you have for them in supporting their patients who are inquiring about discontinuing some of their psychiatric medications as well?
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, hello, psychiatrists. Hello, my fellow psychiatrists. Yeah, I think that, I don't know. I mean, I think that we're really like taught in this kind of bullied way how to be rigorous physicians and how to basically say like, there's no evidence for that, and to like sort of put down things and to be pretty dismissive is like the cool way to seem rigorous and smart. And I think we all just need to like humbleify a lot. I think that when a patient comes forth and says, here's my experience, but you think, well, that's not what I was taught. That's not what I read. That's not what's published in the peer-reviewed journal. Rather than dismiss, invalidate, gaslight, why can't we meet that with, oh, maybe, and to basically start to reconcile that with what we think we already know and just be open to changing our minds. So I think if you're a psychiatrist and patients are coming to you, I get how busy we are. I get the medical legal massive cluster that is getting people off of meds. It's a problem, but like we signed up for, this is a vocation. Like we're not trying, like this isn't about it being easy. Like we're here to serve. And I think to be in service to people who want to get off of meds, go do research, like go to Inner Compass, go to Mad in America, go to Kelly Brogan's resources, or go to my resources, or watch these kinds of videos and listen to podcasts and get a feel for here's how people are navigating this process. There is no answer. There's no protocol. Like we're all sort of figuring it out for ourselves. And then have it be a really nimble process, really dynamic process you do with the patient, where you err on the side of going gradually, and then you stay your ear to the ground where you're thinking like, how's this going? How are you doing? And you learn from it and just be like open to kind of stumbling through it. And you can be open with the patient and be like, I haven't done this before. We're going to figure this out together. Patient's going to be like, I haven't done this before either, but like, thank you for being willing to walk with me on this journey.
Yeah, that's so important. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for just being here and for answering all my questions. I know that the time is up now, but yeah, how can people get in contact with you, or how can they learn more about you?
Yeah, I'm like all over the internet at this point. My website is ellenvora.com and my Instagram is @ellenvoramd. And I'm also on like Twitter and Facebook and TikTok even. And so I just try to churn a lot of content out, mostly on my Instagram, but going on podcasts and just kind of putting this message out into the world. So there's lots of ways to learn more.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ellen. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And thank you so much to everybody else who joined us. We have so many people talking in the chat. It's incredible. So thank you so much for listening in and taking this time to just, take care of yourself or whoever else that you're here to help. And so, yeah, great. And also for those of you who are interested, on October 22nd, same time as this event, I will be interviewing Dr. Rosita Arvigo, and she is a physician, she is a master herbalist, and she has incredible experience studying with Mayan shamans over the past 30, 40 years. And so I'll be interviewing her on spiritual healing with plants. And so we will be talking about spiritual bathing. We will be talking about setting intention and prayer with plants and the incredible medicinal uses of plants for emotional and spiritual well-being. So if you're interested in joining that, make sure to check out my website at zayamed.com. You can also probably, if you go back to Eventbrite, if that's how you registered, you can just find the event on there. I'm sure it's somewhere. If not, feel free to email me at Nadia, Nadeya, @zayamed.com. So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you once again, Ellen. And yes, we will.